I took a DNA test for fun, and it told me the woman who raised me isn't my mother. I need you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I had to sit with it for weeks before it even felt real. I wasn't someone who grew up suspecting anything. I never looked at old photos and felt a strange distance I couldn't explain. My mother cried at every school play I was ever in, even the terrible ones where I forgot my lines. My father fixed everything in our house with duct tape and stubborn pride. I was loved so loudly and so constantly that the idea of questioning where I came from never once crossed my mind. Not for a single day of my childhood. Not even in the small, quiet moments when kids sometimes wonder about things like that. So when my coworker kept talking about her ancestry kit at lunch, laughing about some surprise percentage in her results, I ordered one mostly as a joke. I spit into a tube in my kitchen, sealed it up, mailed it off, and forgot about it completely. That's the thing nobody tells you about these tests. You send away a piece of yourself and then life just keeps moving and you're not braced for anything because you never expected there to be anything to brace for. The notification came weeks later while I was standing at my stove, stirring something I don't even remember anymore, and I almost swiped it away thinking it was spam. But I opened it, and I remember the exact feeling of my stomach dropping when I saw the word mother sitting under a name I had never heard in my entire life, listed as a close relative. Not a distant cousin. Close. I actually laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, because my brain refused to accept it. I told myself the test glitched. I'd heard of that happening before, some mix-up in a lab somewhere. I told myself this so many times that night that I almost believed it by the time I went to bed, and I remember lying there rehearsing the explanation like I was preparing to defend it to someone. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark with my phone glowing on my chest, staring at a stranger's photo I'd found in under a minute, and something about her eyes made my whole body go cold. I don't know how to explain that feeling to you if you haven't had it. It's not logic. It's something older than logic, some part of you recognizing something before your mind is ready to admit it. I kept zooming in on that photo, on the shape of her mouth, on the way she tilted her head slightly in every picture, and every single time I told myself I was imagining it, and every single time some quiet part of me didn't believe that at all. For days I carried this secret weight around with me, going to work, making dinner, having entire conversations with my parents while this thing sat lodged in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow or spit out. I'd be sitting across from my mother at dinner, watching her laugh at something my father said, and this thought would rise up out of nowhere, sharp and unwelcome, wondering if the woman across the table was really who I'd always believed her to be. I hated myself a little for even thinking it. Finally, I asked my mother, as casually as I could manage, if she still had my birth certificate somewhere. My hands were sweating as I said it. She said, "Of course, sweetheart," without even looking up, and pulled it from the same folder she'd kept in the hallway closet my whole life, tucked between old tax papers and my childhood vaccination records. And there it was. Both of their names, printed clean and official, black ink on a form that looked exactly the way a birth certificate is supposed to look. I stared at it so long she asked if I was okay, and I lied and said I was just being nostalgic. She smiled like that was a perfectly normal thing to say, and put it back in the folder, and I went home that night with my chest still tight. It should have ended there. A real birth certificate with both their names should have been enough to close the door on the whole thing. But it didn't close, because that DNA match was still sitting on my phone like an open wound, and no birth certificate was going to make it heal on its own. So I did something I never told my parents I was doing. I requested the original hospital records, the ones filed the day I was born, before anyone had time to shape the story into something else. I remember the envelope sitting on my kitchen counter for 2 full days before I could make myself open it. I'd pick it up, put it down, pour a glass of water I didn't drink, and pick it up again. When I finally tore it open, my hands were shaking so badly I ripped the first page a little, and I had to sit down at the table before I could keep reading because my legs didn't feel steady enough to hold me standing. And as I read, line by line, I felt something inside me quietly start to come apart, like a house losing its walls one at a time while you're still standing inside it, still trying to figure out which room you're supposed to be in. The records said a woman had given birth in that hospital the same day I was born, and that she had already signed the papers weeks before she ever went into labor. She never held me, not once, not even for a moment. And the two names written down as present in that delivery room, the two people who walked out with me in their arms that same day, were my mother and father. No separate adoption filed years later. No paperwork trail anyone could stumble across by accident. Just a woman who made her decision early, quietly, before I even existed outside of her, and a couple who was already standing there, ready, the second I arrived. I didn't say anything for 3 days. I just watched my parents move around the house, my mother humming while she cooked, my father falling asleep in front of the television like always, and I kept thinking, they built an entire life around a secret and never once let it slip. When I finally sat them down at the kitchen table, my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "I know," I said. "I have the hospital records. I know you were there before I was even born." My mother's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, her hand trembling just slightly against the ceramic, and her eyes filled up almost instantly, like she'd been carrying tears behind them for years, just waiting for permission to let them go. "We were always going to tell you," she said, her voice cracking on every other word. And then a year passed, and then another, and it got harder every single time, because you were just ours. Telling you felt like admitting you weren't, and that was never true, not for one single day. My father hadn't touched his coffee. He was looking down at the table, turning his mug slowly with 2 fingers, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "The day we carried you out of that hospital, that's the day I became your father. Not before. Not some piece of paper signed weeks earlier. That day, standing in that parking lot with you wrapped up in a blanket too big for you. Nothing about this changes what I felt walking out those doors. I believed every word. I could see it in how badly my mother's hands were shaking. But there was still a woman out there somewhere who carried me, who never knew what happened to me afterward, who had spent 30 years without a single piece of information about whether I was safe, whether I was loved, whether I was even still alive. And some part of me needed to see that for myself, quietly, without disturbing anything. So I found her. It didn't take long, not with a name and a birth date and enough patience to search through public records until an address matched up with everything else I already knew. I sat with that address open on my phone for almost a week before I let myself drive there. I told my parents I was visiting a friend out of town. I wasn't ready to explain what I was actually doing, not until I understood it myself. The house was small, painted a soft yellow, with a porch swing moving slightly in the wind and a garden that someone clearly cared for. I parked across the street and just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then the front door opened, and a woman stepped out into the yard, calling something back into the house, laughing at whatever answer came back to her. It was her. I recognized her immediately, the same way I had online, except now she was real, moving, alive, watering plants on a porch like it was any other ordinary afternoon of her life. 2 kids ran past her toward a car in the driveway, a dog barking somewhere behind the fence, a man appearing in the doorway behind her with car keys in his hand. A whole life, complete and full, moving forward without a single piece missing from it, because as far as she knew, nothing was missing at all. She had no idea I existed. Not really, not as a grown woman sitting in a car across the street from her house. Whatever she remembered from that hospital room 30 years ago, whatever decision she'd made and however she'd made peace with it since, she had built a life afterward that didn't have a gap shaped like me in it. And sitting there watching her laugh with her family in that front yard, I understood that walking up to that door wouldn't heal anything for either of us. It would only hand her a question she'd never asked to carry, and I didn't have the right to do that to her, not when I already had everything I needed waiting for me at home. I watched for a few more minutes, long enough to memorize the sound of her laugh carrying across the street, and then I started the car and drove away without ever stepping out of it. I drove straight from that neighborhood to my parents' house, 3 hours with nothing but the road and my own thoughts for company. My mother opened the door before I even reached the porch, like some part of her had been standing there waiting since the moment I left that morning. I walked straight into her arms and held on longer than I have in years. My father came around the corner, asking what happened, his voice already tightening with worry, and I pulled him in two, both of them at once, right there in the doorway. "I found her today," I said, my voice breaking against my mother's shoulder. I sat outside her house and watched her for a while. She has a whole life, a family, kids running around her yard. And I didn't go in. I didn't even want to. My mother pulled back just enough to look at my face, her thumbs brushing the tears off my cheeks. "Why not, sweetheart?" "Because I already have a mother standing right in front of me," I said. "And there's no version of family, anywhere, that could ever feel more like mine than the two of you." My father wrapped his arms around both of us at once, right there in the doorway, and said the only thing that made sense in that moment. "Then let's go inside. Dinner's getting cold, and we're not finishing this conversation standing on the porch."